Friends, welcome back to Miss Eshelman's Excellent Adventure. Check out my hat. I'm really excited about these hats. I think we're going to sell a few of them. So stay tuned for that info. All right, anyway, we are going to talk about wildlife management strategies today. So we have talked about ecosystems and ecoregions. We've talked about what is threatening ecosystems. Now we're going to kind of go to that next level of how do we manage this kind of multi-layered thing, right? So we're going to talk about management strategies, and then you are going to find a current event of management strategies in practice within the real world and how they have either failed miserably or gone very well. Okay? So let's go. Okay, here we go. Okay, so what do we manage when we're managing for wildlife? First things first, we're going to manage their habitat. And there are different habitat management strategies that we use in order to ensure that wildlife have the best possible home. Obviously, we're going to manage the wildlife through all kinds of strategies. We'll just go over a few today. And then we need to manage those threats. We need to work really hard to make those threats less of an issue for those ecosystems. So let's start with habitat. So we do a lot of waterway rehab. Okay, when we talked about threats to ecosystems, we talked about things like pollution, resource animals being able to get to resources and things like that. And a lot of times that revolves around their waterways. And animals being able to get to and use waterways is really important. And so we do a lot with waterways to ensure that they're as healthy as possible. We'll do fires to make sure that the habitat is healthy, which seems a little counterintuitive, but we'll talk about that in a second. We like to use grazing practices so agriculture can actually come in and help out and help out that habitat for that wildlife. And then we also use seeding practices, mostly in the Western United States, and things like in the prairie areas and things like that. Seeding isn't as important, but it has become pretty critical within the Western United States. Waterway rehab. So these are just some fun before and after pictures. The biggest thing you'll notice is the plant life around the water. And so that is called the riparian area. And that's a very important area. It allows for animals to live within that area, but also be protected when they're down by the water. It also is very important for the soil of the riverbanks or even lakes. Because if there's nothing there, there's nothing holding that soil there, and water moves. So a lot of times they will work to repair those waterways by fixing that riparian area, making sure there's some really strong plant life nearby. Another thing about rivers is narrow and deep rivers are very healthy rivers. And so if we have a river that has widened out and shallowed out, we'll have a lot of problems with algae, and that algae will then cause kind of a ripple effect through that waterway system. And so a lot of times they will work to repair the shape of the river as well as the flow of the river so that it can be as healthy as possible. Fires. We actually use controlled fires quite a bit to manage forests mostly. So there's this thing called ecological succession, which basically means the order in which things grow. So grasses will come in first and grow first, and then we'll have these little kind of these annual flowers and little plants, and then shrubs will come in, and then these big trees will come in. And if your forest has gotten all the way to the point where it's just a bunch of trees, there's a lot of resources before that the population might depend on and can't use any longer. Also, if we get to that really late point of succession, we're setting up the forest for really intense fires that can have a pretty negative impact on those ecosystems and the wildlife within it. So they do prescribe burns a lot to kind of hit that reset button on ecological succession so those resources are there, but it also prevents those really intense fires that can have a pretty negative impact on the ecosystem. So they fight fire with fire. Or prevent fire with fire, really. Okay, anyway. Our next one is grazing. So this is very important in the Western United States, very important for agriculturalists all across the Western United States. So mostly beef cattle and sheep. And goats too, I guess. In some areas. I mean, not all of anyway. So they do a lot in terms of getting those grasses out of there and keeping control of plant life, and they help a lot, and they prevent some of those forest fires from getting really bad because they eat that fuel source. And so grasses, when they get into the summer and they dry out really bad, they can light on fire really fast. And so if we have cattle in there in the spring or sheep in there in the spring that can get rid of all that grass by eating it and using it, then the fires that could be happening later in the year aren't going to be as bad. Our last one is seeding practices, and so they will actually go out and spread seeds across the desert. On the left here, all the way left, that before picture, that is cheatgrass that has invaded that ecosystem, and that is not good. Wildlife won't eat it. Natural plants, native plants, have a hard time out competing it, things like that. And so there's been a lot of research from Nevada, Utah, and Idaho in terms of how they can combat that after fires. And so after fires, they'll go in and they'll seed, like the dudes on the right. Actually, they're collecting seed. But anyway, they'll go in and they will seed some of these native plants in there and try to get them started before that cheatgrass can come in and take over again. They also go and, like I said, collect seed throughout ecosystems. We can manage the wildlife itself through population surveys, hunting and fishing practices, and restocking and reintroducing practices. So population surveys I think they're actually really cool. So they can do them from the air and they can do them from the ground. So they'll take planes out. I think they're doing more and more of this with drones, which is kind of cool. But they just go up high and they can cover a lot of area, and they can do a lot of population surveys of the population wildlife as well as habitat and really critical resources. Maybe the wildlife in the area really relies on a lake that is really hard to get to. Well, they can fly over to it and see how those populations are interacting. They can also count populations. So much like this middle picture, this big picture, they will literally take photos of herds, take them back, get them developed, and blow them up a little bit and count. Sounds super tedious. The other thing they can do is go from the ground, and so they can hike around and find those populations and take photographs of those herds. We do a lot of population control and management. We do a lot of habitat management. We do a lot to manage through hunting and fishing practices. So over here on the right, that is the game management unit map, which they actually use they will manage populations specifically within those units. And so let's say unit 31 is not doing so hot, or the deer herd in there or something like that. They also do a lot of migratory tracking, population tracking, and they may understand that the herd that populates area 21, 30, 31 is the same herd, right? And so they get to know those herds really well. They get to know those populations. They get to know their health and the herd health as well as population health, and they can make hunting and fishing management decisions based on those. They do the same thing with fishing in terms of different species, different waterways, different times of the year. And so, they're not going to, they might limit when you can fish based on spawning or based on a run or based on whether or not that fish species can handle being caught in, I don't know, December. So a lot of choices can be made based on the species itself as well as populations within that area. And a lot of management goes into hunting and fishing, and they do a lot of data tracking and things like that. So over here on the left, they've done a lot of population modeling, and they do a lot of that based on hunting results. They also do a lot of that based on survey results. And so if you look at this bottom table graph, that's a graph. And it is the post-hunt population estimates. I have to wait for that bar to go away so we can see the key. Okay. So the blue is the estimated population in 2017. The red is population objective. That's kind of the baseline. And then the green little things are, it says N classified. I'm not really sure what that means. Anyway, what you can see is they are tracking population estimates based on hunting results and so on. Then restocking and reintroducing. We restock fish all the time. We reintroduce species. I don't want to say all the time, but it's not unheard of, and it's a pretty common practice to reintroduce species into ecosystems. This one on the right happens to be a Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep in the Ruby Mountains in Nevada. They're the only mountain range. It's the only mountain range in Nevada where they are native to, and through a lot of population surveys and so on, they realized that they needed to do some genetic variation and they needed to do some population management. So they went and trapped this bad boy up in somewhere in Canada, British Columbia, I want to say, and put a tracking collar on him and put him out in the Ruby Mountains with a couple girls. They made like a little teeny tiny flock, put them out there, reintroduced them, kept track of them to see what they were doing, where they were going, and so on. I don't really know what ended up being the story of that, and we reintroduce fish all the time. Whether it's just to have fish available to catch, or whether it's for habitat restoration, or whether it's for species restoration, we do it all the time. And there's hatcheries all over the place. We also have to manage threats. We do that through managing our invasive species or trying to control invasive species through legislation and through this idea of conservation and preservation. So invasive species control, we can do this a few ways. The one that you guys have probably seen the most are things like those watercraft inspections. If you drive into California, if you have any produce or plants in your car, we call them bug stations. If you have any produce or plants in your car, they will inspect them for bugs because they do not want an invasive species to come in when the bulk of our fresh fruit and vegetables in this country are grown in California. And so they don't want bugs coming in that will turn into an invasive species. And so they will inspect those plants and vegetables. And that prevents the spread of invasive species. The latest one is these silly murder hornets. We're all gonna die. 2020 is just out to get us, guys. Anyway, there will be management practices in place for those as well. I feel like if you have a giant hornet on you, you're gonna know. The other thing they'll do is they'll go out and spray, like this guy over here on the right. So they'll go and they'll spray different invasive species, or they'll spray for bugs, or they'll spray different stuff. They'll go out in the field and actually try to manage that invasive species. And another thing they'll do down here on the left, another thing they'll do is biologic controls. I forgot the word biologic for a second. So they will actually introduce a whole other species into the system to manage that invasive species. And as you can imagine, sometimes it is an epic fail. Sometimes it works out really well and it's very cost effective and it's great. And other times, not so much. And that might be a cool current event to find. There you go. Legislation is another one. So they create laws in order to preserve ecosystems and wildlife and manage wildlife. I shouldn't say preserve. We're going to get to that later. Anyway, they create laws in order to protect ecosystems and wildlife, and in order to manage threats, mostly human threats. But there are other threats that they'll try to manage. Grazing is heavily legislated. It's water usage is heavily monitored and legislated. So, but things like game wardens, having seasons on our hunting and fishing, giving you tickets for dumping your crap in the middle of the desert. Those are all things that they do and have in place in order to protect the ecosystem and the wildlife that live within it and the habitat. Lastly, we have conservation and preservation. And so the idea behind conservation is that we're still going to use that thing. So this top table here is hunting quotas in, I'm assuming, Africa. Which I actually thought this was a really cool table, which is why I included it. There's all kinds of things on there. Anyway, so now I'm like reading the table. I need to focus up here. So they will use hunting quotas in order to conserve populations. And so they'll say, hey, we have 50 billy goats. That's excessive. We have 50 billy goats in this game management unit, which means we can afford to give out this many tags. They also look at success rates and things like that to determine quotas, but those quotas are designed to conserve that population and make sure that that population stays at a healthy level. Another thing they'll do is things like campgrounds and state parks, and we still get to go and use the forest and enjoy nature and be out there doing what we do, but they have different strategies that they can use to conserve that area. So a campground, instead of letting people just go and camp willy-nilly and drive wherever they want, they'll kind of consolidate people in this campground, and they keep that campground clean, and they do certain things to manage that campground, but that keeps everybody from like going off in Timbuktu and doing whatever they want, which allows us to continue to conserve that forest. On the flip side of that, there's preservation. And preservation is essentially the idea that this land should stay the way that it has always been, and it should stay the way that nature has intended. I don't want to say we don't do a lot to manage them, because we do, but we're not going out of our way to develop hunting quotas and things like that. That would be considered a human influence, and they want to keep that area out of human influence. And so one of our biggest examples of this happening on a very large scale is the National Park Service. You can't hunt in Yellowstone because those species are protected there. Because they are there, they should be preserved, they should be part of the ecosystem and the way it has always been. And so there's a lot of management practices in place to make sure that that park stays the way that it was way back when our boy Teddy decided it needed to be a national park. Same thing for Yosemite, same thing for Rocky Mountain, Great Basin. All of those are specifically set aside to make sure that they stay the same and that we can enjoy them for generations. And that's the idea of preservation. Conservation is more of we can still use it and enjoy it, but we need to be careful about it. So you are going to do a current event. You're going to find an article from within the last year that discusses one of these management practices, and it can be a success story, or it can be how this has totally failed, how their management practice just like really blew up in their face. There's tons of these out there. Maybe figure out what's going on with the hornets, or the Australia wildfires could be, I think you could probably do this with that. And I'll bet you there's a lot of articles about how not doing management practices led to more severe fires down in Australia. So, there's that. You could talk about wolves. Everybody likes to talk about wolves. There's a lot of things that you can find to talk about. What are we doing? What's going on? What's working? What's not working? Then in a Google Doc, you're going to do this in paragraph form. You're not going to answer the question with 4 words. You're going to do this in paragraph form, okay? You're going to describe the ecosystem they are discussing, And be sure to keep in mind all 4 components. This might take 1 to 2 paragraphs, so you got time. You can like kind of tell me about that ecosystem. Tell me about where it is. Tell me about those living things there. Tell me about factors that may affect it that are non-living. And then, are they in this article? Are they talking about managing the habitat, the wildlife, or a threat to the ecosystem? And what kind of strategies are they using? And then you need to discuss like how did those strategies succeed or fail. And then you have to predict. So you might have to like kind of think bigger than the article. You're going to have to predict some of the larger impacts of these decisions. You are not going to copy and paste anything. Well, okay, you can copy and paste the link. You can type out the article title. That's not difficult. You can copy and paste the link. That's the only thing you're going to copy and paste in this whole thing. Okay? We're not going to copy and paste the thing. Also, I decided like, I don't know, 5 seconds ago that I'm going to make this extra credit. So it is worth up to 10 points of extra credit. It's not going to go in as an assignment, so it can do nothing but help your grade. It's going to be beautiful. But you really got to earn those 10 points. Like, really, really got to earn them. So if it's only worth 3 points of extra credit, because extra means that you did extra work, right? So if it's really only worth like 3 points of extra credit, I'll give you those 3 points of extra credit, but I'll allow you to get up to 10. If you really put in some work, give me some good paragraphs, put some thought into it, talk about something that truly is current and from within the last year. I don't have a problem giving you some extra credit if you really put some effort into this bad boy. All right? Okay. As always, let me know if you have questions, and happy almost end of the school year. We're getting close, my friend. Stay happy, stay healthy,